the failure that changed building codes in the USA. Every day, people enter offices, apartments, schools, malls, and factories without noticing the invisible systems protecting them. They don't think about exit widths, stairwell enclosures, fire ratings, load calculations, or inspection schedules. All of it fades into the background because when safety works, it disappears. What most people never realize is that nearly every modern building safety rule exists because someone once assumed it wasn't necessary, and that assumption killed people. American building codes were not born from foresight, they were born from failure, from moments when normal life collapsed in public view, forcing society to confront what it had chosen to ignore. One failure, in particular, did more than expose a flaw. It shattered the logic behind how buildings were designed, regulated, and morally justified in the United States. To understand modern buildings, you have to understand why safety was once optional for most of American history. Construction followed a simple priority order. Speed came first, cost came second, everything else came after. Buildings were private property, and what happened inside them was considered the owner's responsibility or the worker's risk. Cities were growing faster than laws, factories multiplied vertically. Tenements stacked families floor by floor, materials were cheap, flammable, and poorly tested, fire departments were underpowered, inspections were inconsistent, enforcement was political. The dominant belief was that regulation slowed progress, and in a rapidly industrializing nation, progress was treated as sacred. Most people assumed that early safety regulations must have existed in some form. That common sense would have limited the worst excesses, but that belief collapses when you look at how buildings were actually used. Factory doors were often locked during work hours to prevent theft or unauthorized breaks. Stairwells were narrow because they wasted rentable floor space. Fire escapes were bolted onto buildings as visual compliance, not functional infrastructure. Elevators were unreliable. Sprinklers were considered unnecessary expenses. All of this was legal. The assumption was that accidents were unavoidable, that fires were acts of fate, that workers accepted risk as part of employment, and because those affected were usually poor, immigrant, or powerless, their deaths rarely generated sustained outrage, until one day, the system failed in a way that could not be ignored. In 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It wasn't the first factory fire in America, but it was the first that unfolded in front of the public in real time. In a way that made every design flaw impossible to rationalize, the factory occupied upper floors of a high-rise building. Hundreds of garment workers, mostly young women, were crowded into narrow workspaces filled with fabric scraps and wooden tables. When the fire started, it spread faster than anyone expected. Workers tried to escape the way they had been trained to, toward exits, but the exits were locked. They tried stairwells, only to find them filled with smoke. They ran to fire escapes, which buckled and collapsed under weight. Elevators made a few trips and then stopped working. Within minutes, windows became the only remaining option. People began jumping because the building gave them no other choice. Crowds gathered on the streets below. Firefighters arrived quickly, but their ladders didn't reach the upper floors. Nets tore under impact. Bodies fell in full view of the city. This wasn't hidden behind walls. It wasn't a statistic buried in reports. It was visible, violent, and undeniable. What shocked the public wasn't just the number of deaths, it was the realization that every fatal decision had been built into the structure itself. The building hadn't failed structurally, it had failed morally. In the aftermath, investigations exposed a reality that many had suspected but few had confronted. The building met existing laws. The owners had not broken the rules, the system had. Safety regulations were revealed to be fragmented, outdated, and designed around appearances rather than outcomes. This moment marked a shift in how Americans understood responsibility. Before, danger was considered a personal risk. After, it became a design problem. Public pressure exploded. Newspapers published diagrams, reformers organized marches, survivors testified, politicians faced questions they couldn't deflect. For the first time, building safety was framed as a collective obligation, and that changed everything. Committees were formed not just to punish, but to redesign. Engineers were asked to imagine failure as the default condition. Not what works when everything goes right, but what happens when everything goes wrong. This led to a new way of thinking about buildings. Exits were no longer symbolic. They had to function under panic conditions. Doors had to open outward. Stairwells had to be fireproof and enclosed. fire escapes had to be load tested, occupancy limits had to be calculated and enforced. Materials were no longer judged only by cost, but by behavior under heat. Inspections became systematic rather than occasional. Violations carried penalties. Compliance became continuous. For the first time, safety became measurable. But this didn't happen overnight. There was resistance. Developers argued that costs would skyrocket. Businesses warned of job losses. Property owners claimed overreach. These arguments weren't new. They were the same ones used before the fire. What changed was credibility the disaster had made. The consequences of inaction impossible to deny. The trade-off was no longer abstract. It had names, ages, and families. As regulations tightened, something unexpected happened. Buildings became more predictable. Fire death rates dropped. Evacuations became survivable. Disasters still occurred, but fewer people died, and over time, the public stopped seeing safety rules as extraordinary. They became normal. This success created a template. Other cities copied the reforms, states adopted similar codes. Eventually, model codes emerged that standardized best practices across regions. The most important transformation wasn't technical, it was philosophical. Before, buildings were designed for use. Now, they were designed for failure. This mindset spread outward. Structural engineering incorporated redundancy. Electrical systems added safeguards. Elevators gained emergency controls. Emergency lighting became standard. Every addition traced back to the same principle: assume something will go wrong. American building codes became a living archive of past mistakes. Earthquake zones added flexibility after collapses. Hurricane regions strengthened wind requirements after destruction. Fire codes evolved after new materials introduced new risks. Each rule carried memory. What's often misunderstood is that innovation didn't drive these changes. The knowledge already existed. What was missing was obligation. The failure didn't invent safety, it enforced it. This distinction matters because it explains why codes often feel reactive rather than visionary. They aren't designed to imagine perfect futures. They are designed to prevent known horrors from repeating. That's why building codes feel conservative. They resist shortcuts. They slow experimentation, but that resistance is intentional. It's the cost of forgetting. As cities grew taller and denser, the consequences of failure multiplied. A single design flaw could now affect hundreds or thousands of people. Regulation scaled alongside risk. Responsibility shifted from individual judgment to collective enforcement. Architects became legally accountable for safety decisions. Engineers had to certify calculations. Owners were obligated to maintain compliance. Inspectors gained real authority. Safety stopped being optional. Over time, this framework extended beyond fire. Structural load standards prevented collapses. Accessibility laws ensured inclusion. Environmental codes addressed health. Emergency planning accounted for human behavior, not idealized movement. Buildings became systems, not shells. The irony is that when building codes work, people resent them. They complain about costs, about delays, about bureaucracy. What they're really reacting to is the invisibility of prevention. You don't see the fire that didn't spread. You don't notice the crowd that exited safely. You don't remember the collapse that never happened, but absence is the point. The failure that changed American building codes didn't just improve construction, it changed how society understood progress. Progress was no longer defined by speed alone, but by resilience. That idea now feels obvious, but it had to be learned the hard way. Modern cities depend on trust. Trust that structures won't betray their occupants. Trust that systems will fail gracefully, rather than catastrophically. Without that trust, density becomes dangerous. Urban life becomes fragile. The buildings around you are not neutral. They are arguments. They represent decisions about whose lives matter, how much risk is acceptable, and where responsibility ends. Once you understand this, you stop seeing codes as paperwork. You see them as scars. Each rule marks a moment when optimism failed and reality intervened. And once you notice this, you start seeing it everywhere, in doors that open outward, in stairwells that feel oversized, in exits you never use. There are reminders of a failure that refused to stay invisible, and a society that finally decided it wouldn't accept that cost again.